Here's the most counterintuitive thing about the explosion that tore through the world's largest gas complex this June. The blast that killed 13 people and lit up the sky over Qatar barely moved the global price of gas. And the reason it barely moved is the actual story. On the night of June 21st, 2026, a fire and explosion ripped through the Barzan facility inside Ras Laffan industrial city, and yet the market shrugged. Not because the event was small, because of where, in a precise technical sense, it landed. I am going to argue that the explosion's market weight came almost entirely from what it signaled, not from what it physically destroyed. This topic invites a who's winning, Iran, Qatar, the West reading. I won't give you that. Instead, I'll give you a test, a framework with a falsifiable prediction, and I'll run it honestly, including the evidence that cuts against my own thesis. Here's the route. 1. What actually happened. 2. Why the location matters more than the fireball. 3. The framework. 4. Stress testing the official story. 5. What would prove me wrong. Let's go. This is a deep dive into a single paper, a pre-registered analysis of the Ras Laffan explosion and how shocks compound at a chokepoint hub. I'll keep my own conclusions clearly separated from what's established, what's projected, and what's merely claimed. One promise before we start. The facts first and only the facts. On the evening of June 21st, Qatar Energy reported an operational incident during the startup of operations at Ras Laffan, an explosion and fire at the Barzan local gas supply facility. The plant had been deliberately shut since December 2025 for maintenance, and restarted only about 2 days before the blast. Early on June 22nd, the Interior Ministry reported 54 injured and 18 missing, and launched a search operation. By that afternoon, the consolidated toll was 13 dead and 66 injured. The 13 who died were Indian and Pakistani workers. Authorities described an internal explosion caused by a technical malfunction, reported no public hazard from leaks, and brought the fire under control. The blast was reportedly felt across central Doha, more than 70 kilometers away. Those are the established facts. Everything contested comes later, and I'll flag it when it does. Now the context, because without it the explosion is just a tragedy, and with it the explosion is a stress test. Months earlier, conflict had already battered this complex. Following the onset of hostilities in late February, Qatar suspended LNG production on March 2nd after a strike on Ras Laffan. Then strikes on the 18th and 19th of March damaged 2 of Qatar's 14 LNG trains and 1 of 2 gas-to-liquids trains. On the official account, that removed roughly 17% of export capacity for 3 to 5 years and forced a force majeure declaration. Hold on to that 17% figure. We'll scrutinize where it comes from later. The point for now, by June, this was an operator desperate to prove it could come back online. The explosion happened during that fragile comeback. Here is the distinction that almost all the early coverage blurred, and it's the hinge of the entire analysis. Barzan is not an LNG export plant. Commissioned in 2022, it supplies pipeline gas to Qatar's domestic system. Power, water desalination, industry, plus secondary streams like condensate and sulfur. The LNG export trains run on separate process streams, so a fire at Barzan does not by itself cut export tonnage. A detail that surfaced since confirms the pattern. Qatar's helium output, about 30% of world capacity, produced as a byproduct of LNG, has been offline since March. The damage clusters in domestic and secondary streams, not in the export flow. Keep that in mind. It's about to explain why the market barely flinched. To see why the signal mattered, you need the geography. Ras Laffan ordinarily supplies close to 1/5 of the world's seaborne LNG, and every single cargo must pass through one narrow corridor, the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar has no overland alternative. On the scholarly reading, this is a textbook concentration risk, a huge share of a commodity flowing through one complex and one waterway. When a hub like that carries geopolitical risk, that risk gets transmitted and amplified into global prices. So the market was already nervous, already pricing a premium long before June 21st. That pre-existing nervousness, the premium already baked in, is the key variable. The paper calls it P0, everything turns on it. A quick word on method, and I'll keep it short, because the substance matters more than the machinery. This is a single case study using cross tracing. The technique for testing whether a proposed mechanism actually links a cause to an outcome, step by observable step. The proposed mechanism has three links. 1. A prior geopolitical shock sets a durable risk premium. 2. A later local accident, even without damaging exports, acts as a signal that raises perceived fragility. 3. That signal sustains the premium while the real physical disruption stays domestic. That's the whole method. The interesting part is whether the case actually behaves that way. So let's put numbers and structure on it. Here's the framework in one line. The change in the priced-in premium equals two channels added together. The first channel is direct physical damage. The second channel is the signal, and crucially, that signal term is multiplied by the premium already in the market. In plain language, an accident's market punch depends on how nervous the market already was. Drop the same fireball on a calm, low-premium hub and the signal channel barely registers. Drop it on a hub already loaded with geopolitical premium and the same accident gets amplified. For Barzan, the direct damage term is near zero. It didn't hit exports. So almost all of its potential market effect runs through that signal channel. That is the thesis, stated as something that can be tested. And to be honest about what this is, the equation is a qualitative encoding of the idea, not a fitted statistical model. It's there to make the claim precise enough to be proven wrong. The honest way to run a test is to commit to your predictions before you see the result. So the paper registers 2, dated to June 22nd. Prediction 1, testable now. Because the explosion didn't hit exports, the real physical disruption should land on Qatar's domestic system, power, water, petrochemical feedstock, and the operator's messaging should stress export continuity. Prediction 2, registered for a later test. Any price reaction traceable to the explosion alone, once you strip out the Strait of Hormuz and the weather, should be modest and should fade as the fire is shown to be contained. Why register prediction 2 and not just answer it? Because, and this is the intellectually honest core, the price data didn't yet exist in usable form. 1 day of trading, tangled with a heat wave and a chokepoint crisis, can't isolate anything. So I'm staking the claim in advance rather than reverse engineering it later. So how does prediction 1 hold up? On the evidence available, it holds up well. Independent analyst commentary anticipated exactly the domestic squeeze the framework predicts, that the Barzan outage would mainly hit Qatar's home market, potentially forcing petrochemical feedstock to be curtailed so that power and water get priority. And the operator's public messaging did exactly what prediction 1 said it would. It stressed repeatedly that exports were unaffected. On this reading, the non-price half of the mechanism is corroborated. The damage went where the framework said it would, and the messaging emphasized what the framework said it would. That's one half of the test passed on the evidence as it stands. Prediction 2 is where I have to be most careful, because this is where it's easiest to fool yourself. There is an earliest signal. On Monday, June 22nd, European gas futures, the TTF benchmark reportedly rose on the order of 2%. But the same coverage attributed that move to three things at once: a European heatwave, renewed US-Iran tension, and the Barzan blast. A small same-day rise is consistent with my modest move prediction, but here's the catch I won't paper over. A small rise is also exactly what an unrelated heatwave plus Hormuz story would produce. So it doesn't yet discriminate between my explanation and a rival one. What it does establish is that the price record is no longer empty, just too short to separate the threads. The forecast that the move decays, that's a projection. The real test comes as the series fills in. One more piece of evidence, and this one's important because it doesn't rely on the operator's own numbers. Was the pre-existing premium, P0, really large? Independent market data says yes. After the March strikes, Brent crude briefly traded above $119 a barrel before settling. And the International Energy Agency reported that by mid-June, the European gas benchmark stood roughly 35% above pre-war levels. Those are independent readings of a market carrying a heavy geopolitical premium, exactly the loaded condition the framework needs for the signal channel to matter. A framework you can't break isn't science, so let me try to break this one with a contrasting case. The framework predicts that the same kind of accident at a hub with no geopolitical premium should barely move global prices, because the signal term gets multiplied by a premium near zero. Is there such a case? Yes. Restart and shutdown explosions at ordinary refineries. The Husky Superior refinery blast during a 2018 shutdown is one, were locally catastrophic, drew full safety board investigations, and yet left global benchmark prices essentially untouched. Same type of accident, no premium to amplify, no global price effect. Barzan, same type of accident, huge premium hypothesized amplification. They differ in exactly the variable the framework says should matter. That's the contrast that turns a story into a test. There's a second reason this explosion was, in a grim way, predictable, and it has nothing to do with sabotage. The safety literature is blunt about it. Facilities are far more dangerous during transient operations, startups, shutdowns, restarts, than during steady running. One foundational study found that while a plant spends under 10% of its time in these transient states, they account for over half of process safety incidents. Barzan exploded 2 days into the restart of a plant that had been dead for months. On this reading, that's not a freak event, it's the single most dangerous window in the entire operating cycle. The base rate alone makes an accident entirely plausible. Which brings us to the most sensitive question. Qatari officials stated firmly that the blast was an accident and not sabotage or any hostile act. Given that this very complex was an explicit target weeks earlier, that attribution deserves scrutiny, not reflexive acceptance and not reflexive doubt. What supports the official account? The timing fits the most dangerous phase of operations. The explosion was internal and localized, not part of a broader strike wave. And senior officials committed to it on the record, with an investigation opened. What remains genuinely unknown? The forensic signature hasn't been released. Internal overpressure versus external impact. The specific failed component hasn't been named. And there's an obvious institutional interest in an accident framing. It avoids re-escalation during fragile diplomacy and reassures buyers. So I treat the attribution as a claim, plausible but resting on evidence we haven't seen. The base rate supports it. The forensics are pending. Now the part most analysis skips. Let me argue against myself. Name the things that would show I'm wrong. 1. If the investigation concludes the blast was hostile, my independent technical accident premise collapses, and this becomes a different story entirely. 2. If a large durable price move turns out to be cleanly attributable to the explosion alone, my modest and fading prediction fails. 3. If exports were in fact materially cut by Barzan, my central claim that the damage was domestic is simply wrong. 4. If buyers start repricing long-term contracts on this single event, the signal stays modest, reading breaks. 5. And this one I want to underline, that headline 17% capacity figure traces back to a single originator, Qatar Energy itself. No independent audit. If it's revised, the size of the premium I've been leaning on changes with it. I'm telling you the load-bearing number is unaudited, because you deserve to know where the weight sits. Let me draw the honest line between three kinds of statement, because keeping them separate is the whole discipline here. Established. The explosion happened during a restart. 13 died. Barzan is a domestic plant, not an export train. The market reaction was muted. Projected that the price effect of the explosion, once isolated, will stay modest and fade, a forecast. Claimed but not confirmed that it was definitively an accident, and the precise 17% and $20 billion figures, which rest on a single source. As of the latest check, the investigation is still open and nothing in the picture has shifted the findings. When the forensics and the price series arrive, some of that last column may move into the first, or may not. That's the point of registering predictions instead of asserting conclusions. Step back, because the value here isn't really about one Qatari plant. It's a way of thinking about compounding shocks. The standard frameworks treat these hazards separately. Energy security scholars model chokepoint and transit risk. Safety engineers model facility accidents. What this case exposes is the interaction. An ordinary technical accident, landing on a hub already loaded with geopolitical premium, gets its market meaning from that premium, not from its own physical damage. On this reading, the danger isn't any single shock. It's the multiplication. A technical failure arriving when the market is already primed. That's a lens you can carry to any concentrated, contested piece of critical infrastructure, not just this one. 3 takeaways follow, and I'll offer them with appropriate humility. First, restart safety governance deserves to be treated as a peak risk event. Facilities coming back from long or unplanned outages should face mandatory, independently verified pre-startup reviews. Because the data says that window is where things break. Second, concentration is the underlying vulnerability. Importers leaning on a single hub and a single waterway should diversify both supplier and route. Third, resilience planning has to treat technical and geopolitical risk as interacting, not as separate line items. Strategic storage, contingency routing, and the diplomacy of keeping waterways open all together. So, back to where we started. An explosion killed 13 people at the world's largest gas complex, and the global market barely moved. The resolution of that paradox is the whole argument. The market reaction tracks the signal, not the fireball, and the signal landed on a domestic plant while the export trains kept their footing. I've tried to hold an honest line throughout, separating what's established from what's projected from what's merely claimed, steelmanning the official account, and naming the evidence that would sink my own thesis. The strongest version of this analysis is not "I'm right." It's "here is a test, here is what would prove it wrong, and here is what we'll know when the data arrives." If the forensics show an attack, or the price series shows a durable spike, you'll have watched me set the conditions for my own correction. That's the deal, that's the work. If this way of thinking, frameworks over verdicts, tests over takes, is what you're here for, that's the whole channel. Rigorous strategic analysis, sources shown, claims tagged, and an author who tells you where the weight sits. The full paper, with every citation and the verification table, is linked below. I'm Dr. Naim Tahir Baig. Thanks for thinking this through with me. I'll see you in the next analysis.